Hi, good afternoon, everybody. There will be two of us presenting. I'm Bella LaPointe from Howard University. My colleague, Makita Keeban, she's from Northeastern University. And I got to look at the title of the session. I know it was long at one point, and then it got reduced. But we're basically going to be talking about issues of diversity as it relates to screen time use and reduction. And so I'm going to start out with what I call views of screen time awareness and reduction. And I'm basing this on some conversations that I had with about 20 parents from diverse groups. And you'll see my screen in terms of what groups they were: African Americans, Caribbean Americans, Latinos, Saudi students from Saudi Arabia. We have a large group of Saudi Arabian students at Howard University, and saw some of them in the hallway and said, hey, can I talk to you for a few minutes, and had a conversation with them. And then, of course, some colleagues of mine who are just, and no doubt their awareness is somewhat for sure tied into educational status, where they're just outraged like me. Then I also teach a course at Howard University. It's at the undergrad level, and I got my inspiration from this conference, CCFC, over the years. And I said, well, since they can't get to the conference, I'll bring the conference to them through a course. I've been teaching it probably for 6 years. It's called Youth, Consumer Culture, and the Earth. I put the Earth in there because I connected the dots. The more we consume with all these products, and many of them are throwaway products, if we're not recycling, we're harming the Earth. And even sometimes with recycling, because some things just don't disintegrate. I'm getting ready to change the name of the course, adding in screens. I asked my undergrads, I said, look, I'm thinking about doing this. What do you think? Does screens, do you understand what I'm talking about? Now I'm using Richard Free's book, and he uses screens throughout, and a lot of the literature has screens in it. But they said, well, not sure. I said, so what do you think I should use? There's a little silence, and it's like, what about media? Yeah, that might be better. But I think I'm going to have executive privilege and in the course title so that they get accustomed to it. I don't see it disappearing anytime soon. It's used across disciplines, in the academic literature, in the public literature, so I'm going to stay with, I'm going to put screens in there. And being at a university, we've got to, in a sense, I may not have to get it approved just to add one word, but I certainly have to let the chair know, and then I've got, it's got to then go over to the registrar's office. I don't know if I have to take it to the dean's. You know, it's just oftentimes bureaucracy. But I was able to get the course in and through without much ado, and I'm very thankful for that. All right, so let me get started. So the purpose of my discussion group, I can't call it research because, again, technically I did not go through our institutional review board, but that's why I just called it Views on Screen Time Awareness and Reduction. And so here's the overall, overall purpose. Gotta hit the button. Every device is different. Okay, so some views on screen time awareness among diverse groups: parents, families, undergrad students, awareness of screen time and its reduction as a social problem for youth and families, and then some views on strategies to reduce and monitor screen time. One of the things I want to call your attention to, which relates to diversity in my opinion, I put parents, families, and undergrads, because there are a lot of, especially ethnic group families where there may be generational households, and so to be inclusive and maybe not to use grandparents all the time, and it's not just grandparents, there can be aunts and uncles in homes where, especially single mom homes, and they may not even be living there. They could be in close proximity, but not necessarily living in the same household. So I'm trying to be more inclusive and use the word families. Okay. Okay, so there's our purpose. Other things, I wanted to get their views on what kinds of interventions do we need. And I specifically probed around schools. I included faith institutions because, again, for many low-income families and ethnic families, faith still resonates with them. Not all of them, but for many. Community organizations, government, what would they like to see to reduce screen time? And then what are some implications for making these changes? So I, of course, looked up the research, and as you all know, our youth of color are really overexposed to screen time. And there can be negative outcomes for youth of color. They tend to be more negative with being overweight, the obesity. Did not include, but I have a suspicion, issues of anxiety, depression. There was an article recently that hit the Washington Post when a young black girl in a residential charter school hung herself. And the article talked about data from the Centers for Disease Control that talked about how, in some ways, it was unusual for a child of color to commit suicide, but they said it's rising. And of course I knew that with all the cyberbullying and again the overuse of screen time that this might be a factor in that. But I need to look at that data more closely before I can add, suicide. Clearly we know that the homicide is there, and I have my views even on homicide. I think it's related to screen time and over screen time use when we talk about the violence that comes through virtually as well as the violence in their community. It's almost like a double whammy of just total desensitization, and you add to that the accessibility to guns, and so I'm probably guilty of just throwing a whole bunch of stuff in the tub, but I'll parcel all of that out when I look more closely at the data. And then of course poverty is a major context for a lot of some of the negative kinds of factors that go on with screen time. Not always, but certainly, and many people have mentioned it here at this conference, that when you've got poverty, you have reduced options for saying, okay, no screen time, and then you gotta ask, well then what? What are we going to do if we take away the screens, if we reduce it? What do we replace it with? And I think that is very, very important. And I know Makita and I, we talked about that we have some perspectives on that, okay? So what I did, I just had some informal discussions with parents so I could get some of their views. And these people I call colleagues of mine in schools. Some were friends, and of course Howard University students. And I would say over the 6 years that I teach the course on youth, consumer culture, and the earth, I have had about 150 students over a period of about 6 years. Students are mainly undergraduates. I am thinking of making the course available to graduate students. And I taught the school sort of like on an emergency basis. I taught it online this past semester. I had a mental block against teaching online. I thought, oh God, it's going to be just this didactic more text information, but we now have the technology where we can see each other, we can interact with each other. There's Zoom now, of course. My university uses Blackboard. Blackboard has Collaborate, where I can control the buttons and I can see students. I can't see what they're doing. They only see me from like a headshot. Like one student had a picture of a cat for herself. So I got to that. And it was the cutest kitty. And I was trained about 6 years ago. I had to do a MASH kind of like update to get myself together. We had a major, it got very, very unusually cold this past winter in Washington. Temperatures were like 5 and 10 degrees. And we had a lot of pipes that burst at the university. Not in all buildings, but in many of them. Mine was not hit with bursting pipes, but furnaces that didn't work, and it was freezing, and I just said, made the executive decision, I'm not going up there. I'm just going to teach online, and I had to, like I said, I had to go to our technology unit to just be brought up to speed more on especially using the feature where we can see each other. So what I plan to do, and I thought about it even just from being at this conference, I just learned so much. I said, use the technology to teach the course 100% online. And just do what the marketing people do. The whole course, all of the materials will be anti-commercialism, anti-technology, but use the systems that are out there to teach. Start where the students are, and then just educate them about the wonderful presentations and all the experts that are like at this meeting and who are not even at this meeting to teach about this good stuff. And so here are the diverse people that I had when I got the information. African Americans, Caribbean Americans, Latinos. As I told you, I had some Saudi Arabian students at Howard who joined in. People were working class and included from a Latino. She actually, through one of my contacts, was not legal in this country, and he actually did a translation between Spanish, asking her questions that I posed to her. Then there were people working class who were on government assistance, and of course there were some middle class people there. And here's the educational background. The majority, I would say, were high school, some college, and then a few with the college advanced degrees. You see the age span there that I had. I would say the majority were the students, of course, under 25, under 30, the adults roughly 30 to 34 years old. Their children ranged in ages at the school level, and then boys and girls, roughly, parents had about 7 to boys, 10 girls. Of course, the majority of undergrad students had no children themselves. And so here were my questions. What concerns, if any, do you have about your child or children being exposed to screens? What do you do to monitor your child or children's screen time? What do other parents or family members do to monitor screen time? What can be done by schools to help parents monitor children's screen time? What can be done by community organizations to help parents monitor children's screen time? What can be done by the government to help parents monitor children's screen time? Okay, about 6, 7 questions. Okay, and so here are some of the responses that I received. What are the concerns of parents? And some express specific harms connecting with strangers who potentially may harm children, the violence, the sexuality, the profanity. What are some of the healthier alternatives to screen watching? For example, people were concerned about families' values, either the fact that many screens are the opposite of kindness, and some are diametrically opposed to their own religious beliefs. Okay.
Did you say, sorry, was the top one, like, was this an order of, like, most responses?
No, I did not rank order,
okay.
no. This is just in general. As a matter of fact, this information, and I've already began to put together an abstract. I've met some program officers at foundations, and I'm hoping that I can get a proposal. I've got some people in place where we're gonna, we formed a team and we're gonna write a proposal. So between what's in the literature, information learned here, we're going to put together a research proposal, but then it could very well, I've got another grant where some other people are working in the area of teacher education, and one component of that project will deal with what do we need to, what kinds of interventions with parents can we have. As a matter of fact, it's mainly on STEM, that kind of curriculum in our schools. But I see an avenue with screens and the technology. This may be a golden opportunity for someone like me to ask these kinds of questions to parents about, the STEMs, they want to do the work around STEM, but there's some cautions that we need to have about STEM careers. And again, I'm very concerned, I think, again, in Diane Levin's workshop, people are moving with curricula, not only K-12, but in our colleges and so forth. It's as if Sputnik was here again. Like, what can we do to get STEM for in our college curriculum? And there are many professors, we get up in arms about just the emphasis on, not necessarily, it's the sciences, and there are some universities where even psychology is considered, and the American APA says that psychology is a STEM area. But many of us are just so concerned that they're leaving out the rest of the disciplines to the detriment of having a well-rounded person. And so anyway, I'm going to see with this proposal that they're doing, if I can slip in some questions and issues around alerting parents, especially to the issue of privacy, the issue of threats to children's social emotional development, and threats to their physical development, not only around not getting out to play, but as the doctor just said, a lot of these issues around changing the structure and function of the brain. And it just seems to me that I should be able to have this in this proposal, but we'll see. It'll depend, of course, on my colleagues, and then what many of us can talk to program officers before we submit to see if this is something that is okay. Can we put it in? And so I'm willing to try. Next question, how do parents try to manage their children's screen time? And so they use passcodes, and many of them talk about the blocks that are on some of the technologies that are used, of course, like television and blocking kinds of access to certain stations, and even on iPads. Many parents mention, of course, some of the challenges where they have to try to balance the work with monitoring and with child rearing and home management. Those are many of the challenges that they face in trying to manage their children's screen time. And even though single parent families may have certain kinds of difficulties, because item 3, it's all on them. But one single mom said, you know what, I don't have to deal with what my ex would say about this. So I set the standards for how to deal with screen time. So again, we would always, I know Makita and I talked about this, all or none, or making the assumption that one group has to do this or are confronted with this. We really do have to listen to the people that we are talking with, okay, and working with. All right, some more responses. They do try to sustain positive parent-child relationships to offset negative screen time. many of them talked about, and again, my group was small, about what can, and in especially the cases of the Caribbean parents, talked about the role that faith-based organizations can play in helping to send the message that, you know, we need to do more about screen time and how it interfaces with children's disciplines. The immigrant parents, and again, that definition, of course, the mom was there and not, quote, legal, and then mothers and families that are from the Caribbean, maybe they might have been in the metro area a generation, but many of them are so set on having their children to have a better life. And they are very mindful and aware of negative influences that can interfere with, I guess, the American dream and wanting their children to have a better life, which again, I see as something we can use, because I'm of the mindset that the American dream, we have to deconstruct and say, what does it mean to us or them to want the American dream? But we know that there are some caveats. There are some negative things going on in the American dream, and that can come from parents, and we need to find ways to use that in our discussions as well as in our materials that we develop. Okay. Here's some more, and I'm getting to the end. So some views on what schools can do. So they mentioned hosting workshops for on information, both the problems and the solutions, host guest speakers coming into schools, get parents involved generally, ways to act to empower parents so that they can understand the relevancy of the topic beyond basically what is marketed to them. The companies have, oh, your child needs a cell phone in order to be safe. I mean, for a number of years I saw those commercials on TV, and the question becomes, what did we do before we had all of this, you know? What kind of resources can the school use to help us? Of course, many schools are set up with websites, listservs for parents, for outreach, but there's the feeling that they perhaps could do more. Community organizations, the roles of recreation centers, and again, faith organizations. What can they do to actively engage youth as an alternative? You know, the after-school programs, weekend programs, again, the workshops, guest speakers, and there can be a debate about some of these after-school programs. Do you charge parents? And I'm reminded of a book that Dr. Ed Gordon wrote, just a minute, Ed Gordon out of Yale, the book is on the tip of the hidden curriculum of, you know, academic achievement. And he wrestled with that question when they were designing projects. And he said, you know, it may be best to ask parents on a sliding scale to put forth some money. Don't make it just a free-for-all. And that perhaps that could help to build in some accountability, not for everyone. Of course, we know that there are people struggling, but I'm reminded of a saying that someone, as a matter of fact, one of the ministers out of Boston, he said some people will buy what they want and beg for what they need. And it's just the dichotomy between, you know, you'll get all this stuff that you want to buy, you got the money to buy, but maybe the things that you need, you're going to beg and beg. So it kind of reminded me of that statement, but we all have to, you know, you got to know the population that you're working with, okay? The government, what role does the government play? And most of the families, they focused on funding from the government for community program and activities as an alternative to screen time. A few talked about legislation. Legislation didn't come up that much to help protect youth from maybe the offensive and the dangerous content. The danger mainly was focused on, the predators who may be lurking on, let's say, the internet, not necessarily some of the dangers that we have identified here at the conference. Okay, so I got about 2 slides. So major issues here. Most parents were unaware of the range of problems and solutions because it's a big area. Most of the government and community interventions focused on funding for community programs as opposed to advocacy and legislation. We know that alternatives to screen time, it's not easy. We can say that we can say just go outside, but there may be challenges. Of course, certain neighborhoods are just not safe. And there are some neighborhoods, like one Saudi mother told me, who was not necessarily in a Saudi community, and she said, well, it's easy to say just go outside, but she said, my child is discriminated against because of what I look like with my dress and the head wrap and all of that. So she said, it's not as easy. Now, it may be, of course, easier if she's in a more similar neighborhood and where people are used to diverse groups. And then, of course, parents' own management of screen time reflects how they were raised. This is nothing new, many times in multi-generation households. But that can be an asset to creating some social messaging when people start reflecting on how they were raised and what grandma said. A lot of those things, those messages and even who said it could be put into materials for reducing screen time awareness. And so here are a few implications. Diverse parents need support in managing screen time, children's screen time use. Families have varying degrees of involvement in their community. Outreach is important in educating and empowering parents. Schools are an ideal place for intervention, either through the workshops, the guest speakers, school listservs. Okay, the research, policy, and program organizations, we need to make sure that we include diverse parent groups in their work. We can form some valuable coalitions. Advocacy organizations should become aware and use culturally responsive messaging to reach diverse parents. There's some natural tie-ins that can exist. Even using, let's say, messaging from the 60s, 70s, and 80s, where, some of these one-liners can really resonate because parents may have heard them through education or community kinds of programming with museums and so forth. So a lot of messaging with a few tweaks, may not be that difficult for parents to understand and to hold on to. It may be that some programs may need to hire either, if not on a full-time basis, but pay parents themselves to be like paraprofessionals to work with organizations to help develop culturally responsive programs. And on that note, I am finished. I think we might have questions after we both finish, or do you think we should take some now?
I don't know, what do you want to do? It's up to you, Dr. DeFrank.
Okay, a few questions and then Makita. Any questions? Yes.
So I work with teens.
Teens.
Me and Laura work with Boys and Girls Clubs of Boston, so really a large age group. A couple of things that I think you've noticed is phones are really like status symbols now. It's like the clothes of my era, the Guess jeans of my era, so now you can see how old I am. But when, I pull out my phone to a calculator, is that the iPhone 8, 9, what is it? They're asking me, they want to see it, and And we see it, I think, a lot when kids pull out their phones. And so one of the hardest parts, I think, has been like changing that. And also, then even that translates online with like the likes and the streaks and all of this stuff. And so, you know, it's like, we work with a very diverse population, and I think that we're really struggling to figure out how to make it realistic in an environment, in an after-school environment where it's supposed to be fun, right? And we have great programs, but when you give teens the option of, you know, all these amazing things for their phone, guess what? Like, the phones win a lot of times.
And we work with 6 to 18-year-olds, so we
Yeah.
also have to struggle with the 6 to 12 because they have their own iPhones too.
And we do have like rules around it, but like in a lot of our clubs have, like, you leave the phone at the front or you put your phones away, but kids are in the bathroom.
I know.
You know.
And
I know you have all the
No,
answers.
no. And we'll certainly have others to respond. Not only is it an issue, I've got colleagues at my university, I read what professors are dealing with at other universities, and we got some of the same issues. Where I remember an article from a law professor, and they've got the luxury of having a classroom where they can just shut off Wi-Fi, and it cuts down upon it. He said they use the Socratic method at his law school, and it's like he got so tired of calling on people, and it would be like, what'd you say? What'd you say? And so that's what he did. And it's a real struggle. Of course, there's controversy because you got some faculty who will say, oh, I can use YouTube or Twitter or Facebook as a part of my lesson plans or to put information on there. So it really, it is really something. And maybe one suggestion is if you can get some parents who feel like you, and even some students. I had a student tell me, you know, I was in a school, and it wasn't I know there is a Waldorf teacher here among us, and she said it was a school where we could not use technology until the 9th grade. And she said, I came to the university and I wasn't behind at all. So there's no need for it. So it's like if we can find people like that who can, hey, come on in and tell me what and how can we develop, parents especially, if you can find those who are at wit's end like so many of us. I'm just sick and tired of this.
We have one camp that last year that we hire the teens and they have, have 15 and up, and it was a cell phone free. So the teens and all of the stuff, the stress, the anxiety, oh, so nice to not have my phone. So the first day it was like, what, we're doing this? By the 3rd or 4th week in Charlestown, and then the kids were not asking about it. Because that, like, you responded to this thing, it wasn't there, so it's...
Yeah, I think there's some places where we can start. We start small and then try to build. And it just might work. We hear the doctor say, okay, 4 weeks in an intervention project or her own work, in the treatment plan, give it 4 weeks, or it was set up to be 4 weeks. It's going to take us longer than 4 weeks to identify youth and their families, and youth at a certain age, that group of teens and maybe the middle schoolers, and we come up with some interventions. I know it's not easy because the system, and I want to mention that, we can use that word, look at what the system is doing to us in the sense of borrowing language from the 50s and 60s in terms of the anti-war messages or just the system. And we don't need to dwell on that because some people, oh, I'm a victim, I can't do anything. But it's kind of like somebody is playing us, and look at the problems that they're causing, and we list those problems from the youth's perspective, from the parents' perspective. And we don't have to put 30 items, but maybe, I think a lot of presenters had about 5 or 6. And then we get a team of people, and we can talk about that more, because I was working in school reform where there had been no real parent involvement. I'll say the semester, the year before, this is a school of about 300 high schoolers in a very economically disadvantaged neighborhood, and they thought we were crazy when we said, you know what, we're going to increase parent involvement. We got on the phone, it was a team, a research team, some university students that formed the team. We put a parent on the team, we had students, or maybe 2 parents. We had a stipend that we paid the students. And with all the phone calls, and it wasn't just come up to the next teacher-parent conference. It's like, look, we're having a festival in addition to the parent-teacher conference. We're gonna serve food, and we got a store to donate, you know, spaghetti and whatever. And we had a huge federal grant. And that next parent-teacher conference, we had a couple of hundred parents to show up. The school was like, what did you do? They thought it couldn't be done. These are supposedly people who don't care about their children. But we did it. We had to roll up sleeves, and then people, you know, some of our undergrad students, they called parents from home. It wasn't like, oh, you gotta, because people were working, so they just took the list home. And we called, and you know, it was a tough situation. I mean, it was kind of tough for us to even get into the school to do the reform, if you can believe that, with blocks coming from, you know, we had a principal change. We had one principal very open, oh, come on in. The other one is like, look, our idea of school reform is basketball night. And it's like, what are you talking about? You know, so you get many, many challenges. And it's like, well, who are you? So what if you're from a university? I could care less, and this was even from people who were alums of the university. I mean, so there can be all kinds of stuff that goes on. We've had our challenges. We know, you just gotta roll up your sleeve, but there are some people who do care and who are on the same page as us. You just gotta keep trying. I'm gonna let her just go.
Yeah, actually, this is a perfect segue to what you were talking about. So Dr. LaPointe and I were talking a little bit beforehand, and so this sort of dovetails in nicely. I'm Nikita Keegan. I recently defended my dissertation at Northeastern University in Law and Public Policy. My study area was network neutrality and access to technology, so this should be an interesting discussion. In a former life, I actually worked to provide technical and soft skills training to Boston High School students to get them ready for post-secondary options, whether those are in the trades or for 2 or 4-year colleges. And this all kind of goes to my talk about technology access and screen reduction. So what I want to do, and we don't have a lot of time here, so I'm going to whiz by a few of these slides, but I'm hoping that we've already started a discussion about reducing screen time for all children. And so we're going to take a look quickly at what the landscape is now, and then I'll share a little bit about my experience working with parents and technology and talking to that, and how we can apply that to the reduction of screen time issue. So we'll take a look at the impact of technology and the different types of screen access, and then we'll have our conversation. So the first piece we'll talk about is technology adoption and how devices are being used and who's using them. We've already sort of hinted at, you probably know some of the answers already because we've been having conversations about this all day. And then we'll talk a little bit about, you know, do devices matter when it comes to screen time and for low income and minority families? So the first piece is technology adoption. Now, I will say that, unlike Dr. LaPointe, there's no, I shouldn't say original research, I'll say original conversations. I've got all my information here insofar as usage from Pew and a couple of other reputable sources, just to set the stage. But lower income Americans do continue to lag behind in technology adoption. And why is that important? We'll see in a minute, because it will dictate the kind of technology they use and the kind of screens they use and the behaviors after that. So, according to the Cooney Center, actually, many of the parents of low-income kids, they were very intentional about the kind of technology they were trying to bring into the house. So they wanted to get, for those who bought PCs and tablets, those were really supposed to be supporting their children's education. That was the intent, okay? And tablet purchases, some were for entertainment, around 30%, but smartphones were intended for communication. And that's important to keep in mind as we keep going. So there is a growing share of lower income Americans who are smartphone, online only internet users. What does that mean? They don't have access to high-speed internet. That's important, we'll talk about that a little bit later. But with these handheld devices, you've got the teens who only have that access. You've got the low-income households. Now, a lot of us are talking about getting rid of cell phones and such, but that's kind of hard to do when the only way you access the internet is through your cell phone. And some families have multiple cell phones, but some families only have a couple of cell phones between themselves. And so when you're talking about putting those cell phones down, that means cutting off access to a litany of things that we'll talk about a little bit later. But you can see that the teens here, they're using it for YouTube, they're using it for live streaming, and Twitch and all those sort of things. I don't know if you guys know what that is, but it's basically a video channel for people. This is a thing. Kids watch other people watch video games now. Like, talk about the ultimate in passive use. We'll talk about that in a minute as well. That's happening. I'm turning the page, but I'm not flipping my slides here. So when we look at the racial breakdown here, we see that blacks and Hispanics, the mobile device priority with whites is pretty much there, but white PC ownership outpaces black and Hispanic ownership. Okay, and the net effect is this, guys. It's really hard to do your homework and do research on a cell phone. You don't have the same sort of opportunities there. You're actually more likely to use that cell phone on the internet for passive activities. And when I mean receiving content, consumerist activities, not creative and educational opportunities. I'm not saying that throwing laptops in everybody's face is the answer. I am not saying that. I am not saying that. However, it is important to realize that some of these folks, some of these populations, they don't have access to technologies that will allow them to learn more about the technology that they're using. And that's very, very important. A lot of these parents are trying to get technology, to Dr. LaPointe's part. Parents are worried about their kids keeping up and keeping ahead. And what a lot of folks do, whether they're low income or not, they throw this technology at the kids or they make it available because they don't want kids to be left behind. Why does this matter with reducing screen time? Parents want their kids to be more technologically literate, right? But we have to basically change that definition or even define that as what technological literacy actually is. Because let me tell you something. Buying stuff and watching YouTube isn't technological literacy. It's a great way to it's consumer literacy, but it's not technological literacy. So you need to understand how that technology works, understand how to code, what the technology is behind the technology. You better believe that Steve Jobs and Bill Gates didn't put tablets and technology in front of their kids. In fact, there's a very famous interview, I think it was in Time or whatever, when Steve Jobs he launched the iPad, and he's talking about how easy it was to use and how a child could use it. The reporter asked him, hey, so how do your kids like the iPad? Steve's like, oh no, man, my kids don't use that. We limit their technology time. So it's about defining what appropriate use is, and also limiting that screen time as well. So just something to keep in mind as we continue on this conversation. And then we talked about the teens, but we should probably talk about the 0 to 8s. Now, you and I know that the APA guidelines say that 0 to 2 shouldn't even be on this stuff right now, but they are. And there's a similar trend about kids using mobile devices, but this is even a little bit more insidious. So folks from low-income households are more likely to use apps, kids' apps, that are free. I'm going to put that in air quotes, because nothing's free, as we all been talking about today, right? But those apps have, in most cases, a lot of ads. So not only is your child getting screen time, but they're also getting bombarded by commercials. It's the ultimate in consumptive behavior. So these devices, and you can fight me on this later, but some of these devices like tablets and smartphones, they really do encourage more of a consumptive behavior pattern and a passive and non-active behavior pattern rather than an active and such. So let's talk about what mom and dad might be doing too. So low-income parents actually this is part of the Common Sense 2017 census, about 10 hours a day on media. So mom and dad are doing this stuff too. But these parents are aware that screen time is an issue and a problem. And they are concerned about their children. In fact, one of the more interesting things that I dug up with this particular piece of research, that Hispanic parents were more likely, Black parents were more likely to be active and interventionist in what their kids were doing online than white parents. Okay? A lot of people don't know that, but that's the case. These are very active parents and very active households. They see that as a problem. Okay? They see it as a problem. So, setting the stage on when you were talking to families about tech and screen time, keep in mind that mobile only, lack of broadband, and other devices that, PCs, it promotes passive involvement with technology. And access does matter because, even with active involvement, children's activities can still be very consumptive with mobile. They can be consumptive on PCs too. You can watch YouTube on a PC and such, but again, with a certain kind of device, and where the technology is right now with a smartphone, it's going to be very difficult for you to do homework. It's going to be very difficult to even figure out what that appropriate, active, creative use of technology is when you're locked into an ecosystem that doesn't allow you to explore other options like a tablet or a smartphone. All right? So I'm not saying that connectivity and more technology is the answer. Yes, I'm a big proponent of net neutrality. Yes, this is what I wrote my dissertation on. But that's not the answer, obviously. Limiting use is key, and defining appropriate use when being used is key. But, remember, when engaging in screen time, you gotta emphasize the creative and active use with kids and families, rather than the consumptive and passive use of these technologies. So that's kind of setting the stage. So how do we talk? So let's talk about defining a pathway for productive and respectful engagement with families. And then I want to open up the floor, obviously not just for questions, but I want to make sure that we have time to have a dialogue to share amongst ourselves what's been working, what's not, where we can have some real takeaways so we can go back to our communities and keep working on this important issue. So, I have 4 basic blocks here. Assume nothing, take a whole family-based approach. Just get in lines with Dr. Point's research. Location, location, location. No, it is not real estate. We'll talk about that in a second. We'll find out. And then we'll talk about sharing your experiences. So let's get to assume nothing, okay? One thing I think as academics, as folks who may not be a part of the communities that we're trying to serve, sometimes we do not, was that tactful enough? But no, and I'm not trying to beat anybody up, I'm just trying to make sure that we're all mindful. But I think we have to be respectful of the communities that we serve and the families that we serve. And remember, you might be the subject matter expert in screen time and such, but folks in the community are the subject matter experts of their communities and their families. And that voice is critical. It's critical. We will not be able to work on the screen time issue without honoring that, using that, and moving with that. So the other thing is, again, don't assume that they're not aware of the issue. Dr. LaPointe's conversations, some of the research from Pew and other reputable sources clearly indicate that it is a thing that parents are concerned about. So don't assume that they don't know anything or they don't care about this issue, because they do. And again, don't assume that they're disengaged from their children's use of technology. Minority families and low-income families care just as much as upper-income families do as well. So, and one thing that in my experience, that I'm sure you've all experienced too, you gotta avoid that, they may be looking for some guidance or some pointers, but you gotta avoid that. I'm, bringing the fire down from the mountain. I'm bringing these tablets down to you to preach you and show you the way, and all that stuff. And I actually even said that I don't even like the word empower so much, because, I'm sorry, because that indicates that you are giving the power to these parents. They have the power, okay? These people are your partners. You have to see them as equals in this fight. If you don't start from that perspective, we've already lost. There's no way to build a coalition like that. There's no way to go forward. So, talking about a whole family approach, addressing screen time issue as a family, not exclusively even as a child-rearing issue. It's interesting. There was a case study from Common Sense in 2006, Connection and Control. Basically, they've got these great instances where you can read about different families and how low-income families, minority families, how they've addressed screen time, what their concerns are. And you can't look at it just as a child-centered issue. This is something that impacts the entire family, and their use will influence what the children do and how they think it's okay. It's about looking at that whole family approach. What do they use the technology for? We're all saying, like, we gotta put smartphones down, we gotta get rid of them, we gotta lock them up. What if that smartphone that's in that home is their only means of communication, their only means of internet? As Dr. LaPointe and I were talking, sometimes this is their only way of doing business. You have a lot of landscapers and a lot of other people who receive calls, and caregivers, they receive calls from their clients. It's not about getting rid of the technology, but it's about being sensitive about what that technology is being used for, and being clear about identifying the appropriate use and limiting that screen time for things that are detrimental rather than helpful for that family. So keep that in mind. Take a collaborative, team-based approach to modifying the behavior around screen time. And I'll give an example of this. So when I was putting together technological education in Boston a few years ago, it was kind of before, we were working, well, let me pull this back. When I was working with the director of my program, it was very difficult. It was an outside-of-school program, it was an after-school program. A lot of the students that we were dealing with, the different populations, immigrant, usually low income, definitely minority. Some of the parents didn't see the value in us teaching some of these skills around Microsoft Word and Excel and basic coding, and also, just some soft skills. They didn't see the value of it. But there were some parents who did see the value and who were very, very enthusiastic about it. So what we did was very similar to what you did. We took some of the families who were receptive or completely signed on to what we were trying to do, and we put together a strategy to have those parents communicate and outreach to other parents who did not really see the value in seeing their kids participate in this program, even though their counselors in their school communities and such, recommended them to us, and bringing those families in and creating a community around what we were trying to do. I think a similar approach can be brought in with limiting screen time and getting the word out and educating folks about that. Clearly, as we've seen from the data, we have parents who care, who are aware, and they've even implemented some strategies on their own to limit that screen time. Use the brains that are in the community to help do this. It's not, build a network, okay? And that's what we did, and we actually had some tremendous success. I think that this kind of goes into that location thing. It can't be exclusively something that kids hear in school or organized from school. To Dr. LaPointe's point, it's a neighborhood and community-based process. We talk about networks, right? You're building a network to tackle this issue. And every node, every piece of the network, now this is the programmer and engineer, but just bear with me for a second. That's two-way, the network denotes two-way conversation. Back and forth, not just one way, and connectivity all around. It's really a grassroots organizing effort. Some of the work I've done actually, and I've done some political organizing, it's analogous to the approach that can be taken with raising awareness about limiting screen time and trying to set and define appropriate use of technology, not just in low income, not just in minority communities, but in all communities, right? So, so that's very important. Again, collaborate with those families that remain active. It's really looking at this thing more strategically and not just point to point. Think of it as a network, think of it as organizing. And it's, like I said, grassroots. Sometimes from the policy perspective, we're always thinking about legislation. We're always thinking about starting up here. sometimes you gotta start over here and have both ends meet, coordinated strategy. You know, one of the last things I'll say is, you know, I feel that limiting screen time is a very important issue. We know it's a public health issue, and some of the techniques that I described are used in public health campaigns. You know, we should use some of those methodologies as well, right? And it's a public health issue, it's an educational issue, but in my mind, it's also a social justice issue. Because when you have poor and low-income folks who are basically boxed in by the technologies that are only available to them because of their economic situation, and doesn't allow them to explore or even command the technology that they're using, that's wrong. That's morally wrong. You're just training kids and those populations to be better consumers and not being creative people and not really taking a part in this new technological future that we're all supposed to be benefiting from. Again, not saying technology is the answer. Limiting screen time is key, but we need to make sure that opportunities are available for all. That's how I'm going to end it, and we're going to open it up for questions and discussion. So what are some of the strategies, actually let me ask you, who's school-based K-12 here? Who's with the community-based organizations? Or it's parents, and you can be both at all. Okay. Preschool, all right, yeah, 0 to 2, no screens. So, you know, it's funny, I have to say, sometimes economics, race gender, you know, we're talking about that issue within that context, but I mean, even folks from higher income families, you know, are struggling with these issues, obviously. And in some ways, you know, I think some of the strategies can be the same, but I mean, even parents who are well versed in this issue can be taken aback. My goodness, you know, I found out that my child, I sent him to daycare, I work full time, I sent him to daycare, I found out that they're showing the movies on Friday afternoons. I didn't even know that. So now I gotta see if okay, can I pull my kid out? Because I don't want him watching these movies that I haven't even seen yet, and I don't know what's going on with that, you know, and make him feel ostracized from his group, and he has to sit and color, and, you know. So, what can I do from a policy standpoint? What can I do from a parental standpoint, you know, to change that culture? Because it's a cultural issue too, right?
How did you handle that?
I'm handling it. So I've been in touch with the preschool, and they actually do have a newly formed parents committee, so I'm going through that, but I'm also checking state regs to find out if that's really okay. Doing some homework around that. Yeah. So even those of us who profess to be technologists, you know, a few degrees, you know, we're still figuring this out too.
3 years old? 3 years old?
5. Just turned 5. He's awesome. I don't know why I said that. But anyway, so you talk about Boys and Girls Club of Boston. You guys talk a little bit about some of your challenges. I'm just wondering if there are any other organizations here that you know are kind of facing screen time issues, and you know what you've done or what you're planning to do to address those. And you've got a room full of really smart, really experienced folks. Maybe we can come up with some answers for each other. Yes, ma'am.
I'm in Parents Across America. We're a national organization that has chapters across the country. And we've done work on screen time and using screen devices. And we actually have a webinar online that addresses some of that. So you can go to our website. And
what's the name of your organization again?
Parents Across America.
Yep.
And I'm particularly Parents Across America, Oregon, because I'm from Portland. And we're also beginning to focus a little bit on Wi-Fi radiation and the health concerns there, because that's something that people are just refusing to acknowledge. And we think there needs to be a conversation about it.
Great. Yes.
I'm the founder of Teachers Resisting Unhealthy Children's Entertainment, Truth. And we prepare materials like this that are all online, uncopyrighted, help parents deal with media and technology. TruthTeachers.org. Like here's an example, using children's books to promote play. These parents are so uptight about using children's books to promote reading, we did one to promote play, how to promote play around using cardboard boxes, around using outdoor play, indoor play, etc. And they're all online. There's a group of early childhood educators in Boston who meet once a month in my dining room for the last 20 years to do this.
Just in your experience, and this is on the slide, do you see this as an educational issue? Do you see this as a public health issue? How does it impact your view and communication with some of the folks that you work with on this issue? Anyone?
So I teach in Boston Public Schools, and at a 3-year-old to 8th grade school, so we kind of span a lot of the ages. And, we've done screen-free weeks and that sort of thing, and we have like a game night next week when it's the first night of screen, to give us a chance to talk to families and give alternatives. And so we write about it in our newsletter. I think we've talked about it as an educational issue and a public health issue, and I don't think we've talked about it as a social justice issue. So I think that's one of my takeaways, to bring that back to our schools. So that's definitely one thing. The other thing is that we've done a good job with the younger grades at the school of keeping the screens. Like we've made that intentional, but I don't know how clear it is to the parents that we've made it intentional. Like, do they realize why we've made, younger than 3rd grade, we don't have screens? I don't know. We could be more transparent about that. And I worry about the older kids who have that one-to-one Chromebook and are playing cool math games. So now I'm going to go back, and when I see them playing cool math games, I'm going to ask them if they know where the ad is.
Yep.
Right? I didn't realize that kids at my own school, and my son's going to school, were playing cool math games at school, and that there's ads
Yep.
on those. So I'm going to, before I bring it to the staff, I'm just going to do a little to see, do the kids even know
Right.
where the ads are when they're playing cool math games. So kind of different things that I'm like, fired up about.
All very important points. And in fact, in an earlier session, and some of you folks, I see some of your faces, they look familiar, we were talking about strategy around schools and basically appropriate use of technology and technology education in general. It kind of goes back to what Dr. LaPointe was talking about, parents being afraid about kids being left behind. Oh my gosh, if we don't have technology before, my kid's not going to know, they're going to be left behind. Well, there's a lot of wildlife people would say, it's not a problem, but I would argue that after a certain age, there are appropriate uses of technology, but the challenge seems to be that there aren't a lot of real policies or rules around even technology curriculum, how those technologies are used in the classroom, how those technologies are used out of the classroom, how parents can support those policies or question those policies. So, again, talking from a strategic standpoint and using that network, that's something that I think that needs to be explored and actually used. Again, in my mind, it's all about grassroots community organizing, really. But, there's institutional things that we need to do as well. So the fact that you talk about this, not even being aware of these things or being exposed to some of these things, doesn't, that kind of pulls up being familiar with what the resources are, being familiar with the issues are, making sure that parents and teachers and community members all are aware of these issues so that we can be consistent in, I don't want to say enforcing policy, but consistent in making sure that young people are using technology appropriately when they're using it. It is hot here, guys.
It's hot.
Thanks for not falling asleep. Yeah.
So there's a recent book by Virginia Eubanks, Automating Inequality, how high-tech
Yes, I actually just picked it up last weekend.
how high-tech tools police, profile, and punish the poor. And it's about algorithmic bias. So your question of what kind of issue is this? I think we have to also pay attention to social justice and equity issues and disproportionate use of technology to unfortunately surveil and to punish people. And so one of the concerns that we saw in San Jose education professor, also with the San Jose Silicon Valley NAACP. And some of the concerns that we had brought up at one of our earlier conferences was about the use of school-issued devices for surveillance and tracking of kids, right? So if they're now kind of paying closer attention to what the kids are doing, it could then potentially link up, that we've talked about school-to-prison pipeline, but maybe detect the school-to-prison pipeline.
Right.
And then so paying attention to those kinds of issues and making sure that it's not gonna, that there's some protections in place. Also, to recognize the connection of the tech industry with the privatization movement, and that a lot of the charter schools have been started as sort of incubators to test out the technology and then to sell it to the public schools. And so it's a complicated issue, but a lot of the money is originating in privatization, tech. American Legislative Exchange Council is pushing a lot of the Virtual Private Schools Act, things like that. And so exploitation of communities of color with the for-profit colleges, the K-12 Inc. and a lot of the online schools, K-12, and then now going into the early learning, online learning type things, you can see similar patterns of where there's exploitation of communities of color with these technologies. And then to acknowledge as well the concerns that you brought of like, what are the alternatives, what are the,
Exactly.
It's a complex issue. But anyway,
But
just wanted to kind of put some of that.
I would also like add to what you say though, I think, we do need to keep an eye and keep these tech companies and all of these other entities accountable.
Right.
But I think also it's incumbent upon us who are subject matter experts or learning how to be subject matter experts on this issue to figure out where there's opportunity to work with some of these entities to not just reverse those policies, but to implement policies that actually benefit our students and benefit our children. So I think there has to be a kind of a proactive
and awareness is the first step.
And awareness is the first step. And let me tell you something, now that we saw Mr. Zuckerberg before, now's the time, guys. Now's the time, because companies are scrambling to make sure that, they're not kind of swept up or identified as one of those companies, so, not to be opportunistic, but hey, you gotta do what you gotta do. A lot of these companies are gonna be looking to form affirmative, partnerships and actually demonstrate that they're responsible, which is fine, well and good, but we just need to make sure that if it's a true partnership, then they have to be accountable and say what they're going to say that they're going to do, and such. But I think this is a time of tremendous opportunity to work with some of those entities to benefit to benefit our kids and to stave off some of the concerns that you were talking about. I'm sorry, you had a question, right?
Building on all of this, I really appreciate kind of looking at this through the lens of strengths and, not just vulnerabilities, but strengths.
Yes.
I think it's really interesting, and the research, I think, shows that there's something to be learned here in terms of the higher level of mediation that we're seeing, like from parents in some of these demographics, because that's a really powerful protective factor. And I mean, I think that can be really, it's almost kind of like some more marginalized communities have better awareness of, this maybe runaway train a little bit, and have been saying hello, and I felt that in people, the families I work with, and
I'm sorry, what do you do with this?
okay. Currently, I'm an adjunct college instructor at a community college and a state university in Michigan.
Awesome.
But my background's also in early childhood, and then I went for my family science degree.
Okay.
Partly because of the inspiration over the years from the work of this organization, trying to see it through that systems kind of perspective. But so I think, when we look at families, I think there's a lot to be learned.
Yeah.
And that could, like you said, I mean, I think I'm seeing a level of resilience and resistance in some of these families and communities that I've had the privilege of working with and being in their homes that has been very instructive for me.
Great.
And I think that's could be an important part of the picture.
I think so. Go ahead, over here.
I just have two kind of questions. One is just kind of what's come up as you've been talking, as both of you have been talking, about what we can do as members of organizations to create better connections and collaborations with organizations that are in the communities that we're serving. You know, you're talking about, speak about harnessing the energy of people within that community,
Yes.
right, to serve as leaders. And there are people already doing that, right? And so how do we, I don't have any grand answers, but it just strikes me as that it's a really important thing to always have in our heads is what kind of partnerships can we go into right from the start, rather than, you know, bringing in our expertise and seeing who we can find to who's like, oh, well, they're with us, let's use them. But there are people who are already doing this, right? And within communities that may not be our own, right? And so it strikes me the how important it is right from the outset to come at this topic from a spirit of collaboration with the organizations that already exist in those communities. And the other thing is just sort of a research interest, which is you commented on the increased monitoring Hispanic families, and I believe the next down was African American families and then white families, and I found myself, just being a researcher, wondering, like, that's a really interesting stat, and what impact does it actually have? Does that monitoring actually have? Because we have like data that says, for example, increased monitoring means increased sneakiness, right?
Right.
So sometimes.
Sometimes, but not all the time.
That's right.
Exactly. And
But like, so what?
Yeah.
So maybe do they have higher? You know, is it effective? Is the monitoring effective?
Yes.
Is it actually having an outcome on the kids' use of the technology, or is it just a data point that exists all by itself about what the parents are trying to do, which is important too? But I find myself really wanting to know that piece. Like, well, okay, great, 44% are really engaged in monitoring. What impact is that having on their kids?
I think more exploration on that issue is definitely warranted. There is a lot of literature around it. So, you know, if you can get some grant money to take a look at it. I'm not being flippant about it though, because I think as researchers, I think, it's important for us to understand what the lay of the land is. And, obviously the more data that we collect, the more we understand the issue from different populations. And that's going to help us shape policy. It's going to help us shape strategy. So I think that's a great point. We have literally 2 minutes left. Dr. LaPointe, I've been running my mouth here, so
We've been getting information from the audience. Any more comments, questions?
Yeah, just some resources if folks want to connect. So Privacy International
You mentioned
has great reports and resources. They have a little video on data exploitation if people want to kind of see the scope of the issue of what had happened with Facebook and third-party apps and the ways that data could potentially be used, unfortunately. So that's just one resource, Privacy International. I have a blog, eduresearcher.com, where I am connecting research practice and policy in education. And I have a screen time page and an EdPsych and tech page with curated resources of the best best of the web of things that could help parents and teachers on the issue. And then the third one was, I had mentioned the Data Justice Lab, where they're tracking data harms. And so I think awareness around this is one way of getting parents to pay attention and think, okay, well, what can I do to protect my kid, or to at least raise awareness so the kids can be more savvy. I also want to just acknowledge, there was a parent in one of the earlier talks, she's like writing right now.
Well,
you had a really great comment in an earlier session about the kids and teaching the kids to be able to kind of see through the marketing and say, wow, So I think just also encouraging conversations with kids and just sort of like real world, like, oh, what do you see here? And is that one real or not?
And I would bet you, in leading some of those discussions, that those kids are probably even a little hipper.
Yeah.
They probably see stuff that the parents don't even see when they're talking about marketing and information and such. So, I think that was one of your earlier points in that session. So glad you on that.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks for
And all of this is on your website.
Yeah, I do actually have a lot of those other two research sites on eduresearcher.com as well. So, thank you.
And your name again?
Roxana.
Roxana.
Folks.
And she's listed in the book.
Roxana, what's the last name?
Marashi,
Marashi.
M-A-R-A-C-H-I.
Yes. Anybody? Any other comments?
So great.
Oh my gosh, go outside and breathe, like seriously.